remind ourselves of our motivation, why we're here. So I can develop my qualities and be of benefit to others. Finally, the way to say it is just simply bodhicitta, sake of sentient beings. Why am I here? To benefit sentient beings. We probably don't feel that right now, perhaps not even see the logic of it. So it's helpful to point out the logic of it. In order to benefit, it's like you see everyone needs to play tennis, so you think, why am I here? Help people play tennis. But you have to remind yourself you've got to play tennis, first. So that's why you're listening to these, this is why you're listening to these teachings on tennis. So I can put myself together so I can be of benefit to others. Sangye cherang soke chognam la jancho badu dagni kyap suchi dagi chanyan gi personam ki drola penche sangye drumpa shog sangye cherang soke chognam la jancho badu dagni kyap suchi dagi chanyan gi personam ki drola penche sangye drumpa shog sangye cherang soke chognam la jancho badu dagni kyap suchi dagi chanyan gi personam ki drola penche sangye drumpa shog. So any questions from your discussions? Yep. Sit down, darling. This cord's long.
Okay.
Sit down. I think, isn't it? Plenty of cord, yes. There you go, yes. Okay.
We talked about state of mind at death. And we talked about an individual who would be very fearful at the time of death and maybe fighting it. But that individual had, okay, so we've got somebody who's very fearful at death. But you also said that the karma, our strongest karma predominates when we awake.
That's right.
So what does predominate? I mean, is it the karma or the fear? What's the impact?
It depends
of
on
fear?
There's probably so many variations to that. It's not a simple thing, I would imagine. But if you can just think, okay, let's use a simple example. You've learned something, and then and then you suddenly get a big fright. Well, it depends on how much you've learned that thing as to whether or not you can remember it when you get the fright. Because death is just a big shock. So it's a question of how deeply imprinted it is in you. I know when I used to study, I studied singing, and I had to do one of those. My mother entered me into one of those. She was my music guru as well as my cake guru, and she entered me into one of those competitions. But I never practiced enough. I knew the things, but I didn't really practice enough. So when I got there, my nerves were so terrible that I made a mess. So it's like that. It's natural. It's psychological. The more you have practiced, the more you have thought about this, the more you know yourself to go do an exam. You're confident you can do it. If you haven't practiced enough, I've done it sort of okay. I'll be okay when the day comes. Sorry, you'll make a mess. So it's all a question of practice. It's not like, oh, how unfair, the poor thing practiced, then she got scared, then she went to hell. It's natural and logical. So the more you've practiced, the more likely it is that is the karma that will ripen. If it isn't, then it won't be. Do you sort of see the point of it? Yeah. Hang on a sec, let's see if she's finished. That makes... Okay, so that makes... Okay, good, so say more.
Now, what about a person who has done a lot of work all their life?
That's right.
They've accumulated a lot of positive karma, good karma.
That's right.
But they have this fear that comes on them at death. Can you wipe out all that good karma just because at death you...
But you're just asking her question another way.
Yeah, I am. Yeah. Exactly. We're in the same... Can you wipe
But can
out-
you not hear the answer I just gave? Can you not sort of think about it? It's not like a thing that if you do this, you're going to be sent there. You'll be punished sort of thing. It's just you think about it. You think about the meaning of my answer, and it'll be, my point is, how can you, if you've done if you just said it the way you've done it, you've worked all your life, you've practiced Dharma, you've thought about impermanence, and then suddenly you're going to have a panic. I doubt it, frankly. It's not going to be like that. It's unreasonable to say it this way. I mean, it sort of could. You hear about, actually I was reading about, what do you call, stage fright. The extent to which people's fear. I mean, it's hilarious what people do. The level of their stage fright. One guy, one actor, he literally ran away to another country. So but here we are talking not about acting. We're talking about working on the ego. Fear is the neurotic I arising. If you've worked all your life on exactly that, and have thought about impermanence and death, well, my dear, it is almost, it's contradiction in terms. It can't arise. So what you've got to do is think about what fear is. Fear is the neurotic I that when it's threatened is in a state of panic. So of course, if you've never thought about death, never worked on the ego, never, then of course it's going to be rampant every minute. But if you've worked on it, which is what practice is, then somehow. But it's not like anyone's going to guarantee anything. Everything is a question of what happens at the time, according to what we've done. It's a logical thing. I can't say more. Do you understand? Okay. Yeah. I mean, we want to hear, oh, of course fear won't arise. We want to hear that. Oh, well, of course it won't. No. If you've been good, of course you're going to die nicely and go to heaven, sort of thing. That's what we kind of want to make everything nice. But we have to think about it. That's what I think is the best way. Think about it. And it would seem to me logical that, of course, your death will be reasonable. Your death will be going well. You will die well. It's reasonable. It's logical. It's reasonable that if you work on and you're a good person and the imprints are positive, it's reasonable. Is it not?
It certainly seems reasonable. I guess I think about all the ways that there can be chaos.
Well, exactly.
Perhaps,
But chaos is a result of karma.
well,
And if you've created good karma, then chaos, you will have purified the chaos.
but perhaps this person is dying because of a terrible accident and includes members of her family.
That's exactly right. But all these scenarios are also, I mean, it's like you're talking about those things as if they're separate from everything else, but they're not. So what I'm saying is, I would imagine if a person's done a certain amount, a really enormous amount on their mind, really purified, really practiced morality, really purified, taken vows, done all these extra little kind of rocket boost types of things, which we're going to talk about, all these extra rocket boosts to your practice, has a teacher, has devotion, practices purely, does all their prayers and practices, does all the extra little things that help you change your mind, that give the huge rocket boost for your mind to change, then even if you do die in a chaotic situation, your mind will be able to be full of compassion. It will be able to be thinking of others. It will be able to do whatever is most appropriate because you've trained it. You've trained your mind. It's like asking, I've trained for 20 years and will I win the gold medal? But what if someone runs over me? What if I break my leg? What if the storm comes and I can't run in the rain? What if this? What if that? Well, okay. The better you've trained, the more likely you'll be able to deal with it, isn't it? You think of it in an ordinary sense like that. The more you've trained, the more likely you're able to deal. But still, things can come from left field. Still, karma can be very heavy. Karma can be strong in good or bad ways. Meaning a really lousy, crummy person who spent their life being lousy and crummy can transform their mind very quickly if the karma is there. So, I mean, karma's so, it's logical, but unless you're pretty powerful and clairvoyant, you can't see all the ifs and the buts. In the same way you can't about that gold medal. You remember the time that in the Olympics and that one famous runner, she got knocked over. All her training, where did it go? I mean, okay, that sounds like a random thing. So even this is not, it's even less likely for that kind of thing to happen if we're talking about changing your mind, purifying your karma. Someone else. Mike over this side. Mike coming.
Sure. We talked about how do you find a guru, and we talked for about an hour. Okay. Better? Okay. So we talked about how do you find a guru, and we talked for about an hour, and all over the place. How do you find a guru?
Okay. Okay. No, that's good. We didn't discuss that. That's fine. Thank you very much. Let's discuss. You discussed having found one, how you be with them. I mean, how you find, okay, how do you, well, you could have answered it. You could have thought about it. You just changed the subject to tennis. Then it suddenly becomes realistic because we get all kind of a bit airy-fairy when it comes to religion, you know. Well, how would you find a tennis teacher? Tell me what you'd do. Come on. What would you do?
Bounce around, watch people play tennis, find somebody who plays tennis really well.
And keep checking them all and do that thing, check their reputation. So yeah, I mean, so really it is sort of, that's about the only thing to answer. I'll say some more things too, okay, that are the things that we can do internally. Because we're talking here about internal stuff, which is karma, so I'll talk about the internal causes as well. But obviously, on the external level, it's very practical. In the same way you'd find a Buddhist, you go to different Buddhist places. You'd check them out. If you like, you've got a sense, maybe I like Tibetan, maybe I don't, maybe I prefer Zen. You keep looking until you feel comfortable, and then you keep checking that place. It can seem sort of random in the beginning, you know. But then when we factor in karma, which of course we normally never do, but this is the Buddhist view, we have to factor in karma. Let's take my situation. It seemed completely random, my going to my first course, right? I was wanting a spiritual path. After many years of giving up spiritual, I wanted a spiritual path again. So that arose in my mind. I didn't articulate it and say, I am looking for a Tibetan Buddhist Lama. No way. I just thought, I want a spiritual path. Wasn't sure what it meant, right? So then I had a vague idea of what Buddhism meant, but wasn't even sure about that part. I wasn't even articulating it. And then certain conditions in my life came together. I'd been doing kung fu, not karate at the time, and I was doing it every day, and I felt at the time I'd sort of found my path. I liked karate, you know, I liked this martial arts business. So I was doing it every day. Then, and I was in Melbourne, I had a part-time job, and I remember I was doing my karate, and that was it. And the fact is, if I look onto what happened later, I wouldn't have noticed anything about Buddhism because I was so totally into my karate, I wouldn't have stopped doing it to go off to do a course, right? So I was doing this karate every day, and then I was driving my car through the city, and these two old women, I remember, probably about my age now, had stalled their car in the middle of the road in an intersection. So I hopped out. I remember I had no shoes on. I hopped out and helped them push the car over the intersection. And I don't ever know to this day how it happened, but somehow a car that went past ran over my left foot. Now, if I was pushing a car like this and my left foot was behind, it would have been in front of me. So I don't know how they ran over it, but they did. And all I know is I was on the road, and and the first thought was, can't do my karate. I was devastated. I was completely freaked out. And this poor guy came up. I don't remember anything else. And I screamed at him and I swore. And I said, "You ran over my foot." And he said, "Oh, I'm so sorry. I didn't mean to." I remember that vividly. Because I couldn't do my karate. I was just freaked out, you know, absurdly so. And this guy's name was Bill Bright. I'll never forget him. And he drove me to the nearest hospital, which was the hospital where I got born at. I remember that. And he was so kind, you know. And then I was just completely devastated because I couldn't do my karate. I don't know. It was absurdly devastated. It was extreme, unnecessarily so, but I remember I was. And then all of a sudden, someone suggested I sue the man, right? Now, I never thought of these things before. And I thought, sue him? And she said, "Why not?" I said, "Oh, all right." So I found a lawyer, and I sued this poor Mr. Bill Bright for running over my foot, you know. And, and the lawyer was sort of, "Yes, it's so terrible, your karate career's ruined, all these things." And I kind of bought into it, and all right. And then And then, meanwhile, I was profoundly devastated by this ridiculous, unable to do my karate. It just seemed so silly, you know, but I wasn't. I'd finished my job, and I was unable to do karate. And then I was in this restaurant, completely depressed and miserable, and I saw a poster that said about this course at Chenrezig Institute. I was in Melbourne, which is on the bottom, southeast corner of Melbourne, Australia, and then halfway up on the east coast is Brisbane, and then north of there is at Queensland in the tropics. It's like going from New York to Florida, you know, except the other way, up north. Our tropics are up north. So it was this course in Queensland, and this Lama called Lama Yeshe, and this name somehow triggered something. I had no idea. I can't think now even how I'd heard of him, if I'd heard of him, but all I know was I thought, oh, what a good idea. And it was 1 month intensive with Lama Zopa, in fact, the Lam Rim course, and then another month with Lama Yeshe after that. And all I know is I thought, oh, what a good idea. So I went to Queensland. Now all I'm saying is I wouldn't, and that was my first course, and they were my teachers. I've never left them. This is now 30 years ago till this June, okay? I've never left them. I found my home right there. My first day, I walked into this place and I knew I'd come home. I know it sounds corny, but that was the feeling I had, okay? I felt I'd come home. Even though for the first month of those teachings, I'd never a clue what Rinpoche was talking about. Not a clue. It was just gobbledygook for me. But I happily sat there every day. I was happy to be there, even though all these wretched men and then all these women who call themselves ladies who couldn't carry the buckets of water. I mean, I was in a state of shock. I'd been living with a bunch of radical women for several years, you know. I mean, so everything was a shock to me, but I knew I'd come home. I mean, I'm just telling you what I felt. And then I had to do all the processing and all the shouting and the yelling and the arguing with it, and then but somehow that was it, you know. So karma takes care, Lama Yeshe says. So if you consider karma as the main cause of things, then we can see again and again and again in our lives, it's how things happen. You kind of bump into it, including the bad things, which of course we don't like. But so often we kind of don't have a plan for anything, and you meet that person, you find that thing. And I remember even reading about this young white fascist, this white supremacist, when he was 19, and he felt just the same when he first read Hitler. He found his home. Oh, everything I thought was the truth, there it was. I found my home. I knew where I belonged, finally, you know. So, you know, karma takes care. So this is the thing, the real cause, the main cause, must have been all the imprints and from all the work I did in my past life. Let's just look at my life and we can see it this way. And this is the real answer, of course, right? On external level, you go look for a teacher. Internally, those causes have to be there. So since I can remember, I like going to Mass, you know. As soon as I went to Mass, I must have been very little because it's so clear to me that that was my job, to be a priest. I went home and announced it. Well, of course, they all laughed. I'm not a boy, right? And I remember I must have been so small because I didn't understand intellectually the reason you're not a boy. It seemed so evident that was my job. And then since tiny little girl, I always just loved going to Mass and was going to be a priest. And then when I knew, okay, I couldn't be, I thought, all right, I'll be a nun, you know. That was what they told me I could be. I thought, it just seemed natural to me. It just seemed that was my job. Now you listen to people who've been ice skaters all their lives, tennis players, white supremacists. The imprints are there. Mozart got his piano when he was 6. Off he went. So the imprints have to be in our mind. Whether it's carpentry or white or fascism or Buddhism, the imprints of that are already there. It's not some brand new thing that suddenly you see and you go, oh, what a good idea. Because if you didn't have that imprint, you wouldn't think it's a good idea. You wouldn't even hear the word. It wouldn't even occur to you. I would have skimmed right over that boring poster and gone to another one. So really, this is the way that if we think about it carefully, you kind of try to track it like this. We really do set ourselves up. We make our choices. It seems random that I suddenly saw that poster that day, suddenly decided I would go. But all the conditions came together. If I'd seen it 2 days before, I wouldn't have even considered it. I was doing karate. There was no way I was going to give up doing my karate. Absolutely no way. And I was absolutely fixed on that. But 2 days later, I broke my foot. That's why I'm grateful to Mr. Bill Bright ever since. Eternally grateful to him, you know. He was one of the catalysts that caused me to go in what I would now see, so far so good, the right track for my life. So this is the way they say, you know, the past, it's sort of like all the imprints are there. You've done all the work and then you lose your memory. But instinctively you keep doing in that, you go in that direction all the time, you know. So one needs to think about that. So putting it that way, then I can say to you, well, the best way to find a teacher is just want one. Pray every day. Think every day, I'd like one, please. And you'll ripen the karma. It can be like this. There I was. vaguely wanting a spiritual path, not thinking of going anywhere, but because I broke my foot, the poster was there, I thought, what a good idea. So, you know, things come together in many ways. Other people, I mean, there's a friend of mine who was a Buddhist, whose mother's a Buddhist also, and for many years the mother actively went around the world looking for a teacher. You know, she wanted a Tibetan Buddhist teacher. So she kept checking teachers. Are you my teacher? Are you my teacher? Are you my teacher? Kept meeting these lamas. Are you my teacher? Are you my... I mean, literally looking for one because she knew she wanted one. I didn't know I wanted one, but I found one. You're saying, how do you find one? So eventually she found the one who was hers, and he said, oh, I've been waiting for you. Something like that. Honestly, people so often say things like this, you know. Where have you been all the time, right? So, not trying to be cosmic about this. Just trying to factor that piece in. So meanwhile, you keep going to places. You keep checking up, and that is the rational, clear part of it. I still, even though I felt I'd come home, I did all the checking. I didn't just jump in. I didn't. It was sort of like an easy way to get there. I didn't have to search for 10 years. I found the first place, and it turned out they are, in fact, my teachers in this life, you know. So I feel lucky, if you like. I found them right there. But I had to do all the checking, definitely, intellectually, really research it, really think about it, really listen to it, really agonize over it. And I had to do a lot of agonizing. So the thing is, if you could say this, and this is where this idea of thoughts and aspirations comes in. This is the way it works with karma, you know. So you've got a karmic seed in the mind. It's like a seed. It's all right, it's a good analogy, the seed in the ground. So let's say you know it's there and you want to encourage it to come quickly. Well, then you have to give it all the right nourishment. You've got to get it in the right place with the best sun, the best water, even give it a bit of sort of extra juice, you know, with all those extra things you put in. So you really encourage it to grow. Well, you see, that's what thoughts are right now. Thoughts, aspirations, and that's what they call prayers. So if you look at all the quality, look at the nature of a lot of the prayers that we would say, they're all aspirational. May this, may I meet this, may all sentient beings be happy, may I become a Buddha to benefit all sentient beings. They're elaborate, sometimes pages and pages of just elaborate aspirations. So really, the seeds have to be there. So whether it's you looking for a music teacher or wanting to find a Buddhist teacher, the seeds have to be there. You've got to have the seeds there, the imprint, the tendency to play music. That must be there. Because that's even what arises your thought, oh, I'd love to play the piano. Because you've heard music before and it's triggered that in you. So even the listening to music is like the nourishment on those seeds. If you never heard music, you know, it probably wouldn't arise so strongly. So the hearing of the music is simply the nourishment on the seeds that are already there in your mind from having done it before. Mozart's, you know, how he got his piano, I wouldn't know, maybe his mum didn't give it to him. But he got a piano when he was very little, or something like this, you know. Whatever, they were the external conditions. They were like the sun and the rain and the fertilizer that necessary. They're the conditions. They talk about main causes and then conditions. So those things are the conditions that ripened those seeds and that allowed him to then play music. So the conditions that ripened mine were in all my life, all my tendencies, my aspirations, my looking very consciously. All the years I was a bit of an old radical lefty. They're really just another part of me looking for the same thing, trying to find the truth, trying to find what makes the world work. It was all the same. So all my life, in a way, I was nourishing those seeds, wanting the truth, wanting to find what is real, what is not, what is happiness, what is suffering, what causes it, blah, blah, blah. All of that, my life was that, the nourishment of it. And then eventually the karma ripened. The seed was there all that time, you know. So then the aspirations you would have, if you found a thing that you like, let's say the tennis, and now you want to find the best teachers, well then you're already pretty much there. You've already got the thing you like, you've got the tennis. You just got to do your checking now, but really wanting it. And that's all really a prayer is, wanting it. Because you're really wanting the best teacher is what makes you search for it, doesn't it? You go out there, you check it out, you hear about this one, you go to Wimbledon, you don't just sit, oh, I want a teacher, you know, I wish they'd come. You really get out there proactively looking, and that's how you eventually recognize and see. Same with these courses, you know, same with Dharma. So wanting it, aspiring, and just even if you're sitting in your house, doing your practice here every day, wherever you live, you know, let's say wherever you live, say at Santa Cruz, you don't have to go looking for like a needle in a haystack. Not like that woman did. You could, Nothing wrong. She was able to go around different places. But by doing your practice every day, by listening to the teachings every day, and then by making this really strong aspiration, may I find my teacher. I'm not joking. That is very powerful nourishment on those seeds. And when the time is right, you will meet. It might be 5 years, it might be tomorrow, it might be next life. So don't be impatient. Does that make sense? Okay. Just keep trucking. Someone else from your discussions. Yep. Microphone. Oh, went back. Yes,
Back to
my
the
dear.
subject of death and dying.
Yes.
I am what's called a breast cancer survivor, which is a euphemism really for someone whose cancer is in remission for now.
You're sort of a dying person. You were more a dying person before, now you're nearly a living person. Okay.
And the thought of it reoccurring is very, very scary.
Of course.
For all of us.
Yes.
Recently I saw a commercial done by Lynn Redgrave,
Yes.
the actress, and she said in the commercial, she said, I want to die from eating too much chocolate. I want to die from exhaustion from dancing the tango. I don't want to die from breast cancer.
Okay.
What I heard you say this morning was that having the time to prepare for death was a very, very good thing.
Absolutely.
So maybe I should not be so terribly scared.
Exactly.
Of
You're
that-
absolutely right. I would disagree completely with Lynn Redgrave's approach. The Buddhist view, yeah, you finish and sit down and then I can talk about it. Or take the mic. Sit down, darling, take the mic, just in case I want to talk more. No, absolutely. This is the thing, you know. You see, we think about, like she's saying, we imagine, you see, if you think about it, the way we often think like that, like she just said, or die in your sleep, or die with it, because it's the fear of going to it is what she's talking about. Mostly what she's talking about is the horrible fear and the sickness itself and the anticipation of the death. So it's sort of like, if you're going to sort of shoot me, don't warn me, just shoot me without me knowing. That's what we think, because what we're really not wanting, like I said, is the anticipation and the fear, and of course the pain. So then we imagine that if you're dancing and then you die, because you're doing something you like, the dying will be pleasant. Like my friend, like a lot of people thought, oh, how wonderful, my son died doing what he likes. So we kind of fantasize that a bit, but I think if we look more carefully and look at how the mind works and look how fear rises and look how we primordially don't want to die, then I don't think you're going to be happy dying, vomiting from too much chocolate or dying from, you won't be happy because you're dying. Whatever you do when death comes, especially if it's without warning, that will be far more traumatic than even death which is coming from pain. I mean, the pain part is the part that she's talking about that's awful. And of course, one would rather die with no pain. So if you can be warned and have no pain, that would be the best scenario. You see my point?
Yes.
It's the pain that's the worst, because when you see the suffering that people have, that's what's so traumatic. So I think maybe that's the point. But then it's kind of a bit, that's hoping you'd rather, I think dying from too much chocolate is not, that would be horrible. I mean, that would be horrible. I can't imagine how that's pleasant. But it's, yeah, so really the Buddhist one is, of course, if you think of it in the Buddhist point of view, it's just another event that will occur in your life. And I think if we think about it, anything you know that you've got to do, and especially this death one, you've got to do it well, for the reasons that we've discussed, that you've got to move through the life and you want to ripen positive seeds, so you've got to not have fear and die in a really conscious, well way, then to do anything well, you have to prepare. There's nothing we ever do in our life that you can just do out of the blue. So if, of course, death, which maybe she thinks, is simply just this life snuffing out, then of course you don't have to prepare for it. It doesn't matter how you die. So all she's really saying is, and that's the common view a materialist person would have, of course, why die with, have all the suffering first and then die? That's why people want to have euthanasia. So if death is the way the materialists say, then it's true what she's saying. It's absolutely right what she's saying. You get my point here. Yes. But if it is as Buddha says it, then it's really best to get warning. It really makes sense, because you can now prepare. And the number of people who die with hospice service, this is the very thing. I mean, the very thing that everybody says. And they all, most people die blissfully then. So whatever your religion is, or whatever, even if you're a materialist, somehow, But if you've got the Buddhist view, then it really makes sense to die with a happy mind, to die prepared. It just makes sense, doesn't it?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes, it does. Well, right now, one of the things that's been true is when I come up against that yearly set of exams where they look to make sure there's nothing happening, it's terribly scary, and I lose sleep until
I'm sure
I
you do.
hear
That's
the
right.
results.
Right.
And I think that what you've said will make that easier for me.
But another thing to think about, and this we never factor in, you could die of a car accident tomorrow. You see, we're still thinking you're permanent. You're still fixated on this idea that cancer might or might not kill you. But honey, lots of other things will kill you. And my friend, one of my friends, he went to Los Angeles to help his father die of cancer. The father got better. They're all cheering. They're all having a party. He's cheering. His cancer's gone. He died of a heart attack the next day. My friend on death row in Kentucky, preparing all his appeals. Suddenly leukemia comes and kills him in a week. Or whatever. So it's like that's the fantasy too. When you really understand impermanence, so okay, you've got a remission now, but old age will kill you. A car can kill you. Just your karma can run out and you will wake up in another body. Very simple. So, when you think this, the fear anyway will go in a different, it'll become different. Because still you're thinking of yourself permanent with this cancer. And if we can beat that cancer, then I'm going to live. And then old age will get you anyway. So the point the Buddha's really making is we're going to die. We don't know when or how. And that so one of our friends in Texas, for example, is on death row. So he's twice now. He had a date in November last year, and then something shifted, and he had another coming up nearly soon, and they've delayed it again. So each time he's had this remission, But still, everybody's cheering. But we have to remember, and I said to him, you could die anyway. You could die tomorrow. Like my friend in Kentucky who died of leukemia. So we've really got to put the teaching into it properly, So he didn't get killed yet, didn't get executed, but he might, You think this, then you've got to, in a way it'll almost bring up fear again, when you really realise that you are impermanent and you could die tomorrow. I mean, if we were to die tomorrow and you knew you were going to die tomorrow and you had your death date organised tomorrow, you'd be, it would be shocking, cancer or not. So that's the point. We've got to practice every day and recognise that we are impermanent and that death is definite, but the time of death is really uncertain. And it is uncertain because just ask yourself, do I know when I'll die? And we have to say no. We can speculate, it'll be in 50 years maybe, you'll be dead by then perhaps. We could speculate within that period, but there's no certainty. And that's the one to really recognise. Then cancer, not cancer, it'll just be one of the many things, it won't matter so much. It'll shift the whole perspective for you when we really contemplate it.
Thank you.
Okay. Anyone else? Yeah.
So once you've done your checking and you find what you believe to be is your guru, then what?
You ask them.
How?
Ask them.
What?
Ask them.
Then what? They say yes, and then what?
Well, then you start practicing. When you ask your person to please teach me tennis, what happens? What happens then?
They teach you.
Precisely.
Well, first you have to, figure out how much it's going to cost and when you're going to meet, and there's these technicalities.
Well, then, it depends on the person. In my case, when I met my teachers, and Lama basically said he knew that he was my teacher, and when I informed him he was, I went back home after the course and started practicing. Whatever practice I took from that course, I tried to do it every day. He told me some certain practices to do, so I did them every day. And then eventually I decided I'd go to Courtin monastery and to become a nun. That was 6 months later, so I went to Courtin and I became a nun. He organised my ordination. And then I knew also for me I would work for him. I wouldn't just go back home and get a husband and, oh no, I can't be, I was a nun, right? I wouldn't just go back home, like some people do, go back home and get a husband and continue their life and have their teacher and they practice in their daily life. So in my case, I worked for him. So then I stayed on at Courtin and we started doing, wisdom publications had begun at Courtin Monastery, right? So I had already, from the day I walked into the centre actually, was already assumed it was my job. I don't seem to need to get told these things. I assumed it was my job. I remember the person who asked me, would I like to work for wisdom for a year? I was thinking, what's he asking me for? I already know it's my job. It seemed quite evident to me. So I was doing that work. And then I just went to Delhi, and then I went to England, and just continued like that. So my practice was also working for my teacher, right? So it just kind of unfolded. I would take teachings, I would take initiations, I would meet Lama every now and again, but I in my case, very rarely had formal meetings. I've never, in all these years, not had formal meetings about my practice. One formal meeting ever with Lama Zopa Rinpoche about my practice. That's just how it's been for me, you see. Many people have them regularly. Depends on the person. Depends on the person. Depends on the person. On where you're at and what you need and the skill your teacher has to help you, guide you. So for me, it was clear for me, since I look back, that my lamas were showing me that I had to find it myself. I had to do it myself, you know, make my own decisions and decide what was my, you know, and anyway, all the practices are there, the teachings are there, and they're all the same for everybody, but there are variations that are specific to oneself. So at some point, you know, Rinpoche pointed out certain things about my practice, but that was once in all the years I've known. And then from there on, I just continue to go. So as long as you know if he doesn't tell me what I'm doing is wrong, then I assume it must be right. And you get to know yourself, you know, you learn yourself. Because the point is to internalize that wisdom that you get. Eventually you don't need your mother telling you everything you're doing on the piano, you know. You know it yourself, it's good or bad. You're in the right direction. Does that make sense? Oh, okay.
I guess that makes sense to me, but then also in our group it was brought up, and this, I think a couple of people in our group had this question, we didn't figure out the answer, was can you have more than one guru?
Oh, you can have dozens, yeah. Absolutely. Absolutely. Often you tend to have one or maybe two, but usually one, mummy guru. Like they call it the root guru. Right. The root guru. It's a funny phrase, but we can see the meaning of it. Mm. It's the one that you feel is the one that's the main one for you. It's often that way. But Tibetans are into polygamy. You can have more than one. No, Tibetans were. Several of them still. They have more than often one husband. It's just a practical family thing, you know. I'm just going off the subject now. You know, especially the nomads, you'd have more than a couple of sisters would marry the same bloke, a couple of brothers would marry the same woman. It's very common. Still, it's like that a bit, I think. So I'm saying you can have more than one root guru. In my case, Lama Yeshe and Lama Zopa are both my main lamas. I would say that. But I didn't know that I sort of knew it, but didn't. Okay, talking personally here, just talking about how things work, different people. Lama Yeshe was the one I first connected with. I had my first month's course with Lama Zopa Rinpoche, and I knew he was sort of like this perfect person, but he was sort of behind Lama for me. I couldn't see him, is the way I say it. So it was Lama Yeshe who grabbed me, who grabbed my heart, you know, and grabbed me by the scruff of the neck as well. So then I committed myself, and then Lama, my Lama, and then it was always Lama for me, Lama Yeshe for me, and then he passed away after about 8 years. And I had a dream, actually, 2 years after I'd become a nun, maybe the first year after becoming a nun, I had a dream, very vivid dream about Lama Zopa Rinpoche. And in this particular, whatever happened in the dream, and I asked another Lama, I just told him this dream, and he said, oh, that's the Lama who will lead you to enlightenment. And I was very surprised, because I always thought of Lama Yeshe as my main Lama. So then eventually when Lama Yeshe passed away, he passed away in 1984. And Lama Zopa Rinpoche is his main disciple, has been his main, they've been together since, well actually Lama Zopa Rinpoche is 10 years younger than Lama Yeshe. And Lama Yeshe was born in Tibet, and he was educated at the same monastery as the Lama who was here and many of our other Lamas, Sarah J Monastery. And he escaped when he was about 26 in 1959, right? He was 24, actually. 24. And he'd been at the monastery all his life, studying, great scholar, you know, but hadn't completed his Geshe degree. He was about 24. He escaped. And like thousands of the Tibetan monks and lamas especially, they all gathered, they were all sent to this one horrible place called Baksadur. It had been like concentration camp during the time of the British. And of course for these poor Tibetans, the shock mainly was this hideous weather in India, you can imagine, you know. Unbelievable heat and creatures, and they were just dying like flies themselves from tuberculosis, from living in that refined air in Tibet, you know. It was quite a shock for them. The heat was just unbearable, like hell on earth. So he lived in this place called Baksadur, where all the monks of all the different monasteries and all the different traditions gathered together and tried to continue their study, because that's what their job was, to continue their study and their practice in this environment, right? Meanwhile, the Dalai Lama was negotiating with the Indian government to get land and gradually build monasteries down south, and they gradually, continued their infrastructure, mainly their monasteries. This was their main concern, to get their monasteries up and going again so they can carry on the lineages of the practices before they died out, and especially before the old lineage holders, the old lamas, died out. Because the oral tradition in Tibet is very, very, in Buddhist in general, but especially Tibet, it's hugely important. I mentioned it yesterday, Rinpoche, or the day before whenever he talked. They talk about the lineage all the time, keeping the lineage alive, it's so important. And actually it makes sense. Again, if I think of my mother and her cooking. She's my cake guru, right? Where'd she get her cake knowledge from? Her mummy. Where'd she get it from? Her mummy. Word of mouth. It was an oral lineage. This is not a joke. We give all these formal words like oral lineage. My mother didn't say, let me pass on the oral lineage of cake making to you, Bobsy. She just said, okay, honey, I'll show you how to make a cake. But you can see it's an oral lineage. And it's a very vivid thing. It's a real thing, the real experience passed on from one to the next. So anyway, for the Tibetans, the most crucial thing for them was to keep this alive, so they started their monasteries, So there's Lama Zopa Rinpoche and Lama Yeshe carrying on his practice the best they can, because what else are they going to do? They're not going to sit there and fret and get angry and go and want to fight the Chinese. They all know it's karma. They know this is their stuff manifesting in front of them. They've got to keep living their lives. And so at some point, a couple of years after they were there, maybe 1961 or something, 62, Lama Zopa Rinpoche, he was born in Nepal. He was a Sherpa. And he was recognised as a very little boy as the reincarnation of one of the great lamas in their area, who was called the Laudo Lama. He used to meditate in this cave, which is sort of known as Laudo. Laudo means radishes. They used to store the radishes there. So he pulled the radishes out and moved in, this previous Lama. And he meditated the last 20, 30 years of his life there. And then, like these great lamas, died with complete control. You know how we talked about, I'm getting off the stop chapter, keep going on now, but I'm going to come back to the track. It's okay, we're on track here. I just have to remember, that's all. Keep going off. We talked about the regular kind of way you die. I haven't finished, actually. We didn't finish how you die. Okay, too many things keep in my poor old head now, I'll forget them. But we'll talk about that, okay. So what we're talking about is lamas. I was talking about Lama Zopa Lama Yeshe as being my lamas, and how I recognised Lama Yeshe first and then Lama Zopa Rinpoche. And then I talked about how they escaped and how they met. And then I've gone off from there and talking about who Lama Zopa Rinpoche is, and now I'm talking about how he died, and then I'm back to the death one. So see if I can keep all that together, okay? So let's finish the death, and we'll go back to this one, and I'll go back onto the guru one. So, once you stop breathing, it could be a couple of days before you leave your body, okay? And then, as I said, you leave the person. If they're Buddhist, you do prayers and practices for them to make it as conducive an environment as possible for them to be peaceful, even in that time, because the mind is still there, right? It could be like in a coma. They could be even kind of aware, but dead, but the mind is there. Because, people have often, don't they, the leaving the body experience. Many people report that. You leave the body, and you're watching everything that's going on. You're watching it, you can see it, but your body looks like it's dead. So this can be sometimes for people. So if it's all hysterical and neurotic there, you're going to get a bit nervous. Make it as conducive as you can. So eventually the mind will leave the body, maybe 2 days later, maybe immediately. Depends on the way you die, how you die. If it's an accident, it probably leaves straight away because it's such a shock. So then what happens is, quite literally, you'd wake up, there's you, okay? It's you leaving your Robina body. And then the one you think of as you, your mind leaves that body. And then suddenly what you're now in is an experience. It's like a dream. It feels like a dream. But it's very shocking because you're no longer Robina. You've lost the plot. You're finished. Robina's finished. So it's quite a traumatic experience, if you think about it. This bardo, even if you die peacefully, is quite I call it the intermediate state. So when the very subtle mind leaves, it then, like when you go to sleep, you get to the very subtle mind, and it's then just dark unconsciousness. And then at some point during the night, you wake up to this subtle level of consciousness, which is slightly awake, really, if you think about it, but it's a dream state, isn't it? This strange world of your own hallucinations, basically. Dreams are basically hallucinations, aren't they? You visualize all these things happening, and they're not. You're lying in your bed asleep, aren't you? So they're hallucinations, but it's a real experience. So now you wake up in this kind of dream-type state experience, and they call it the intermediate state, the bardo, intermediate between lives, you know. And they say this doesn't last any longer than 7 weeks. Could be a second, but that doesn't mean the experience of it is 7 weeks. It could feel like an eon. It's very curious. This experience of time is very interesting. I remember seeing a movie on a website called To Hell and Back, about this Christian doctor who started interviewing his patients, and they began to reveal terrifying experiences of leaving their bodies. Mostly people talk about all the nice ones, the white light ones, you know. And it was most fascinating. He talked about this one person. One guy was interviewed, and the experience was this. He said he was a bit of a mean guy, a bit mean to his wife and everything, you know, mean guy, right? And then he had to have this operation, to have the heart operation. And he was in the hospital, very worried about it, very fretting and worried about it. And he was in the bed. And then somehow he found himself next to his wife, and he was talking to her because he was worried about his operation. She was sitting there, but she wasn't listening to him, and he got mad at her. And then somehow he looked over at the bed, and he realised he was still in the bed. So his mind had left his body. Now, they normally say it can't be more than a couple of minutes, can it? That you can leave your body before you... I mean, I've heard this. It can't be weeks, you know. It's a few seconds, a few minutes, actually, before something severe happens. So he then said, this is the interesting point I'm getting at. There he is. It's his subtle consciousness, okay? It's like a dream, but it's so vivid. He was in his bed, all right? But his mind had left his body. And so if those doctors had come and checked him, they would have been pumping his heart to try and get him back. I'm going to tell you the story in a second. Another friend of mine talked about how she used to get really abused, brutalised, raped and things by some family. She had this method she had to go away from that was to leave her body. She would be up on the ceiling having her own little special things and watching this poor little body down there. And it was all this nice little experience. She left her body. And then she knew she had to go back to this awful body and this horrible experience, so she'd go eventually. She'd go back there kind of groaning a bit. Well, she left her body. Her mind left her body. If the guy who was doing these things to her had bothered to check, he would have seen that she was dead. You understand? Because she'd kindly left, you know. So the same with this guy. He'd left his body. So then he heard these voices, he said, out in the corridor, saying, come on, John, come on. So he thought, oh, good, I'm going to go to my operation. Because he kind of didn't get it all that he really had left his body. But he kind of vaguely knew it was him over there. But he was so fretted, you know, so freaked out. So he followed them. And it was this weird experience of going along this corridor. And they were being so kind of nice, but kind of slimy nice to him. But he was worried, and he kept worried, where's the operation? He kept asking. And as he was going along the corridor, and he said, this is the thing I'm getting at, the journey along that corridor took as long as walking from here to Alaska. Well, even if here was Oregon, it's a long way, you know. So the experience of time, the reality was it couldn't have been more than a couple of minutes. The experience was as long as just like eons long, so long. So the experience of time is very interesting, isn't it? So anyway, just to finish the story. He was going along and they were getting meaner and meaner and meaner to him as he went, and they were ripping his flesh and ripping him and beating him and being mean and horrible. And then eventually there was absolute darkness and they left him. And he said there was this utter despair, like he had never known. Dark despair. And he didn't know what to do. So he thought, maybe I better pray. And he hadn't prayed since he was a little boy. So he tried, Our Father who art in heaven, and he couldn't go further, he forgot. The Lord is my shepherd, and he couldn't go further, you know. So then he just, from his heart, he just called out, Jesus, help me. And he said from way over there, this tiny light came, and it got stronger and stronger and completely encompassed him. And as it encompassed him, it was Jesus. He said if it had been real, it would have destroyed him. It was so powerful. Completely encompassed him. And so as it encompassed him, it completely healed him. And just absolute bliss. So, of course, he wanted to go with Jesus. This was great, you know. He was happy. But he sent him back. He made him go back. He said, you go back. And he did a deal. He made a deal. He said Jesus said that he'd be there anytime he needed him. So since then, of course, he's become this good man, helping others, blah, 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 you know. So that's interesting to talk about from the point of view of karma. But the story here was really the main point that I was reminded of, was that this experience of time. Because being a human, you've got a human mind, a human body, a human mental sense of reality, which is a relative thing. It's a relative thing, you know. So they talk about hells lasting for eons and God realms lasting for eons. Maybe they do. Maybe they mean human eons, but maybe they mean the experience. I think about this, you know, when I think of that experience. Maybe they mean the experience of it is as if it were eons. I don't know. It's interesting. And then secondly, the point is this, you know, that this bardo, and you know, a dream can seem like a long, long time sometimes, can't it? But it could be like a second or two. So really this sense of time is really a human reality. It's a human conventional reality. So a human being is out there measuring the time while this guy's out in the corridor, feeling like it's walking from here to Alaska, how long it took. But they're checking the clock, it's 2 human minutes. So that's a very interesting thing, isn't it? And then you think about it when you leave your body, when you die. And then you go, you know, say you die here in Santa Cruz, and then a week later you're conceived in Australia. Well, honey, you didn't get a plane. No, not even a week, like a minute later, excuse me, a minute later, you can get conceived in Australia to a new mummy. You didn't have to fly there. You know, what's time then? Your consciousness is here, and now your consciousness is there. So it's kind of interesting, isn't it? So anyway, a regular person, you know, like us, who say, you know, in our case from our past life, we can deduce this because here we are humans. We must have practiced in the past. Here we are sitting in a Buddhist place. We must have practiced something like that even led us here, even for the day. Maybe we won't come back again, but we must have had some connection with it, otherwise we wouldn't be in this place. We must certainly have practiced spiritual path. We're wanting a spiritual path now. That's the imprints in our mind. They are now ripening. So we must have died a reasonably peaceful death because here we are getting a human life. I think I mentioned, but one Tibetan Lama said that at the time of a male, and I didn't mention this, at the time of a male and a female human beings having sex, billions of consciousnesses are all hovering, who have recently passed away. And it's obvious, not just from the human realm, because you've got billions in the animal realm. Billions of consciousnesses that have recently passed away are all kind of hovering about, desperate to get in, you know, in the bardo. Because what it is, you leave the body, it's a bit in there. We won the lottery, we got one. Really. They say if we really realise how much morality we must have practiced to get our little old mummy's human while she's lying down there with our daddy, you know, minding their own business. We can't even imagine. Because, you know, what happens when you die, the grasping is so intense. Even if you've got morality ripening and you have a happy death, that grasping that arises at the time before you stop breathing is quite powerful. And then when you do die, still, even though you've got morality and you're going towards a new good life, because that's already programmed from the time you stop breathing, and let's say your morality ripens and you die very blissfully, which you would, it would be a pleasing experience, then the bardo could still be quite a bit scary, you know, this dream state, kind of weird. And you know with dreams, it's sometimes really awful. Dreams are really awful, you know, you can't get out of them. I had a technique when I was a little girl that if I didn't like my dreams, I always knew I was dreaming. If I didn't like my dreams, I had a certain technique. I'd find suddenly this green or red, like, what do you call it in America? Gurney. Very nice one. Would appear, velvet. It would appear when I thought, I don't like this dream, I want to wake up. And this thing would appear and I would lie down on it and count 10. And then I'd wake up. That was my technique for waking up in my dreams. But sometimes it didn't work. So that's when it was scary, you know, because you couldn't get out of this dream and you knew you're in it. So the bardo is a bit like that, but more intense because Robina's finished. There's no person yet. You haven't got a label yet. You're just this mind. And in a sense, the grasping is propelling you, and it's a very powerful experience. It's sort of like desperately looking for another basis, for another I. That's how grasping works. That's why we rush to any old body, you know. So if you've got karma, you die with negativity, and you've got karma, you're born a lion, you'll run like a magnet to that lion when you see mummy and daddy lion in sexual union. It'll look so delicious to you. It'll appear really nice. So for us, in the bardo, depending on how long it takes, eventually we have, because you're in the bardo, your mind is more subtle. You haven't got a gross body. You're not at the conceptual level. So you're very powerful. You can go here and there like you can in dreams. You can fly, you can do this, you can do that. All sorts of, but uncontrolled. We can't control it. But the mind is more subtle, so it has more powerful experiences, so it has clairvoyant experiences. So because then what will happen is the karma, in our case, the karma ripened for us to go to our new mother's wombs. In my case, there's my mummy, Billy Bliss, Agnes Bliss. I know she was Agnes Courtin by then. She'd married my father. Her family name was Bliss. And I was called out to my auntie, Robina Bliss. Anyway, there's my mummy, Agnes, you know, doing her thing with my daddy, Teddy. Billy and Teddy, she was called Billy. They're doing their thing. I bet they're not thinking about me. Right? And all of a sudden, their egg and sperm come together. The condition ripens, right, for my karma, which is already, my karma was already predicted from the time I left my, however many weeks before I left my body. Sorry, not weeks, days or hours, left my body. The karma has ripened. So eventually the karma ripens and I see them and I go running towards them. So they say, this is really curious, this piece. They say if you're going to be born a girl, your strong attraction to the father is what drives you. It's like the power. The delusions are what propel our mind right now. They're this superpower like a motor, And so huge attachment to the father ripens. That is literally what propels your consciousness and what runs your consciousness. You haven't got legs to run on. The karma, the mind, propels your consciousness to that, to go and have union with your father. This is how they say. And then you're just this little nothing thing, so of course you can't. So then, the anger that rises, which is the response when attachment is thwarted, is what causes you to die in that bardo, and then that zaps you into the new egg and sperm. So it's not a very romantic way to get conceived. It's not a gift from God. It's not something precious. It's kind of intense, and it's driven by delusions, unless you're a holy being, of course. If you're going to be born a boy, you run to your mummy, So with deluded times, and this is a desire realm, Buddha says. It's the nature of it. Look at this universe. This is a bunch of sense objects, isn't it, out there? And attachment is just attachment. And the one we call sexual attachment is just to bodies. Well, people are attached to all kinds of things now. We're so deluded, And it's just very strong attachment. And attachment is what makes you run to something. You run like a magnet, like the fisherman ran like a magnet to the fishing. Mr. BTK ran like a magnet to torturing and killing because that gave him his pleasure. So you run to that new egg and sperm. And I went in. That's it. That's how you get born, roughly speaking. So the holy beings, they're different. In Lama Zopa Rinpoche's case, he was this great yogi. This Kunsang Yeshi was his name. He was this Nyingma yogi in the mountains in Nepal. Actually, his biography, you should read it. It's very interesting. It's been written. It's called The Laudo Lama. Wisdom published it. It's in the shop, I think. It's very interesting to read. It's done very beautifully. And there's a second part of it. It's sort of a brief biography of Lama Zopa Rinpoche in his present life. But it's about his past life mostly. So he was this great meditator, a lay person. He wasn't a monk. And he was a great meditator. And then the last 20 or 30 years, I forget, of his life, like a lot of them, they go to the mountains and then they give up their life and then they meditate for the rest of their life. And so he, like a lot of these great beings, had the capacity, doing all these great tantric practices, they learned to learn to completely manipulate know about and understand and manipulate the subtler energies so they can go through that death process with complete control. They can replicate that process of the dissolution in their meditations, in fact. They can even use their own sleeping experience very powerfully to learn to harness that energy so they can die with complete control. And then they meditate. Instead of just staying there unconscious for 2 days, they can meditate at a very subtle level for many days. And then when they're ready, they choose to leave, and then they choose their new rebirth. They know exactly where they're going to get reborn. So Lama Zopa Rinpoche was reborn to one of his attendants, to one of the women who would feed him in the cave, would take care of one of his students, And then from the time he was tiny, it seems, his sister talks about it, from the time he was tiny and he could crawl, every time his mother would turn her back, he'd be missing. And they'd always find him crawling up this path back up to the Laudo cave. So she'd drag him home relentlessly. Every time she turned her back, he'd be gone. So then when he could talk, same thing. Come home, she'd say. He'd say, no, that is my home. So, they say that's common for these great yogis who can die with complete control, who've totally harnessed the subtler energies of their body and mind. They don't lose consciousness. They don't lose the plot. They know exactly what's going on. They can die with control. They can choose their new rebirth, and they continue without missing a blink, missing a beat. Okay, they've got to wait till they grow up a bit, but they kind of already, since they're very tiny, they can, they indicate they know what's going on already. It's very common among a lot of them. And there's another book that you could read called the Laudo, not the Laudo Lama, the what's it called? Reincarnation, the boy Lama. It's a story about Lama Yeshe and how his reincarnation got found. He's a Spanish boy. He's now about 22. It's a very interesting book to read. It tells you about this process of karma. and how you get reborn. But this is so for these guys, for the holy ones who know what they're doing, it's not a fearful experience. They know exactly what they're doing. They go into meditation. They go to that very subtle level that we'd have to die to get to, but they can go there at will because they've learned to meditate during their lives. They then meditate and they can get all the realizations at that very subtle level because it's no longer encumbered by all the junky mind, you know. And they can then, when they're ready, they can leave the body and they go to exactly the womb they want. They've chosen it. They've booked their womb in advance. Not joking. Truly. They know exactly. So there's this tradition in Tibet where many of the lamas will leave notes explaining exactly how you're going to find them, where they'll be, you know. I mean, Lama Yeshe, apparently, one of his teachers, I mean, you can speculate. These are just, you can think, speculation, but for example, one of Lama Yeshe's teachers, who is now the reincarnation, is that Lama in Portland, who's teaching at Maitri Centre, which will turn into a university eventually, the FPMT Centre in Portland. Yangtze Rinpoche. He is the reincarnation of Lama Yeshe's, one of his Lama Yeshe's lamas at his monastery. And apparently, before he passed away, he gave all his possessions, all his things, all his texts, all his clothing, everything, to one of their other students, who was a monk. And he said, I'll see you later. And this monk didn't understand anything. He took all the things. And eventually, when the Tibet business happened and this monk disrobed, and then he came to live in Kathmandu and got married. He had 2 wives. He's got 12 children. One of my friends is one of his daughters. He always talks about her 2 mothers. So then his first child was, I think the first one was Yangtze Rinpoche. And so then he sent him to Courtin Monastery, where Lama Yeshe then educated him. But this is the point, what I'm getting at, he was recognised as the reincarnation of that Lama. So then the father thought, oh, well, it's interesting, now I know why he's got all his texts. So he got born to him, and now he can carry on with all his texts and his possessions, you know. One Lama, when he was reborn, one High Lama, one of the Dalai Lama's gurus, was born to one very poor person. This is like 25 years ago. And the mother, he was drinking too much milk because she was poor, and she kind of tried to stop him to drink too much milk. He said, don't you worry, I've got 8 cows at home. So eventually he was recognised as the reincarnation of this particular Lama, and when he went back to his house, sure enough, he had 8 cows, you know. I mean, these are all very unusual stories for our minds, I realise. Lama Zopa Rinpoche's mother, who was this, you know, the one who took care of Lama Zopa when he was a little boy, when he'd crawl up the mountains. Oh yes, finished with Lama Zopa. So when he got even a bit older and he started to talk, everything, the sister said, everything he ever did from the time he was tiny was always the behaviour of a monk. All his games were like he acted like he was a Lama. He'd sit on a throne and he'd pretend to make things and he'd ring bells and he'd invite all his friends, and then he'd say, and then my benefactors are coming, and he'd mention all the benefactors from his past life. He'd mention their names, you know. So he always, all these indications, and so because it's fairly common in those areas, she went and consulted the local Lama, and he confirmed, yes, indeed, it would seem to be the reincarnation of that Lama, you know. So he got known as the Laudo Lama. So another story, before I continue on with Lama Yeshe, and how Lama Yeshe and Lama Zopa became my Lamas. Okay, I'm on the track here. Lama Zopa Rinpoche, his mother died at some point. And then she was just this typical ordinary little housewife, you know, hard-working Sherpa housewife who worked very hard to chop the wood, and everything's physical. You know, she chopped half her fingers off from just chopping wood. You know, all her eyes were sort of yucky and ugly because they have these ugly kitchens with all the smoke going in. Then at some point in her life, as she got older, she became a nun. The father died when he was a little boy. She became a nun, and she was a very devoted practitioner. She didn't have much education, but she'd always just say mantras. She said, Om Mani Padme Hum, the whole time. And she was renowned as a really amazing, holy woman, you know. Kind of cranky old thing too, but always praying, very, very devoted to Lama Zopa, kept his cave and all these things, very devoted. And so then she got reborn and was recognised as this little boy. Well, he was about 2. And then just the village up the mountain, not very far. And then the sister, who used to look after the cave once the mother died, Lama Zopa's cave, because people go there to do retreat, right? And then the sister went to this village for some reason to meet the family. She didn't never know about this new child. And she met this new boy. And this little boy, the moment he saw the sister, he ran to her. And he packed his little bag and said, I'm coming home now. He knew already he belonged down there. All these stories about how he wanted to know about how the cows were. And when he got to the house, he went to all the right places. He knew his teeth were up there, and his old potty where he used to go pee was under here. And he saw the cow skin on the wall. He burst into tears because his favourite cow had died. All this stuff was held in his mind from his. I mean, this is what they say. Okay, I didn't meet him. He knew exactly who he was and all the people, and even met all the friends of the mother. And they had a party and a dinner to represent him. And there was one one cousin she used to fight with. So when the cousin came, even the little boy didn't like him, didn't want to speak to him, turned his back, So there's all these stories about, all these stories. And there's lots of Western people who have these experiences, and lots of books have been published now about people who remember. But I suppose this is the point, isn't it? As long as you've got the view in the West that the mind is the brain, and you don't want to consider an option, then of course all this is just cranky stuff. It's just cranky stuff. You can't ever even take it as a hypothesis because it doesn't fit with your present model. So this is why in the West we don't know what to do with dreams, we don't know what to do with all those experiences of people leaving their bodies, we don't know what to do with all these reports of reincarnation, we just don't know where to fit it all. We just think they're all wacky, Which is a bit ignorant, really, to think that many experiences from that many people in that many cultures, you can find a common ground, But even then, among most people, there's not much way of explaining it. But it happens to be, that, anyway, whatever. So then, okay, so Lama Zopa Rinpoche, when he left Tibet, this new, this new one, when he was about 14, he'd was living for a while in a certain monastery away from his own home, and then all this business happened in Tibet. It was in Tibet, just on the border, so he left too. And he ended up also going to Buxador. He was 10 years younger than Lama Yeshe. And so at the monastery, maybe the first year they were at this new place, at this concentration camp, while all the people were sorting out what they're going to do with their lives, one mutual guru of theirs from Serajay Monastery, the one who said, that tongue that spent its life gossiping is now useless. Remember I said that story? Okay, that Lama, Geshe Rabten. He sort of put Lama Zopa with Lama Yeshe. So Lama Zopa talks about how the first time a fellow student of Geshe Rabten brought him to Lama Yeshe, because what happens with these little tulkus, they're called tulkus, these emanations, these reincarnated lamas, as they're called. I mean, he didn't have his family, he was on his own, he was 14. They put them with another lama, like an older monk, really, who then becomes their mummy, who takes care of them, And so this Lama Zopa was put with Lama Yeshe. And so from the time Lama Zopa was 14 and Lama Yeshe was 24, they were together, He would take care of him. And he would be educated by others, but Lama Yeshe would make sure he had enough food and get his education and be his mother and his father, basically. And so then, like a lot of these Tibetans, people who are used to the mountains, Lama Zopa Rinpoche got TB. So they went to Darjeeling, which is up in the mountains a bit, and that's about 65, and that's where they met their first Western student. Then they moved to Kathmandu, she became a nun, and then in about 1969 or 70, I think, they got the place called Courtin, a hill outside of Bodhanath, where they started their first monastery. It used to be the home of the the king's astrologer, the Nepali king's astrologer. So that then Lama Zopa taught the first Western course there to about 12 people in 1971. So then I went there and I met them in Australia in 76. They started travelling to the West in 74. And then their third tour, 74, 75, 76 is when I met them. Okay, so now what was the reason I was telling the story? About how I met my lamas. How I recognised Lama Yeshe first, that's right. That's not more than one Lama, that's right. So I met Lama Yeshe first. I met them both, sorry. But I connected in my mind, my heart with Lama Yeshe. He somehow had a way of talking, and people have known him since he even first began speaking English. Because what was most interesting about both of them, they were among Tibetans, right? But they both started from their own side learning English. There was no intimation of any Westerners in their lives yet, but they both had this compulsion to learn English. Lama Zopa said he used to try and memorise dictionaries, because they memorise everything in the monasteries, And then he'd get Time magazine or something, he tried to memorise. And then Lama Yeshe had this kind of chaotic way of learning, and his English until the day he died was kind of crazy, He just did it spontaneously, kind of read things and heard things. But what was interesting with him, when I first heard my first course, I mentioned, it was very traditional. Of course it was. It was traditional Tibetan structure and the way they talk and the terminology. And so I couldn't get my head around it. I kept thinking, where's the Buddhism? I couldn't hear it, although I was happy to be there. But when Lama Yeshe would come in the evening and give a talk, crazy English all over the place, I remember I transcribed him. I began transcribing. I kind of walked straight into what they call the publishing room and started transcribing Lama's teachings. It was insane English. But he talked in a psychological way, the way we talk in the West. He talked just like we did. He had a way of talking. I remember meeting an American scholar who met him first in about 67 up in the mountains in Darjeeling. And he said he couldn't believe. The English was impossible, but he said he he had a phenomenal ability to communicate with people, and this was the thing. Always Lama Yeshe was known for this, So I liked very much what Lama said, and I felt so connected in my heart, with Lama Yeshe. This first time I met them. But not with Rinpoche. But I knew he was there and perfect, but I didn't there was no heart connection. So like I said, it was 8 years. Even though I had that dream, it wasn't 8 years before when Lama Yeshe passed away. And then I knew somehow, and this is what's interesting, I knew Rinpoche was my Lama too, but I had to work on it. I had to sort of work on it, because I had to work on it. And that just meant for me that what that meant was to practice and then to kind of create the cause somehow, to make offerings and to take request teachings. And then 1 year, 1987 actually, after I'd finished working for Wisdom Publications, one of my jobs for 10 years was working for Wisdom Publications. So 87, I finished that job and I had no idea what I was going to do. And I was in New Zealand doing a retreat with Rinpoche. And he told me where to go. He told me what to do. He never told me before that in all the years I'd known, 10 years I'd known them, 11 years. And he said, it was like, how that picture of Moses in the sky was a God with a finger? I think of it as this. He said, go to Sydney and teach. So from that time, the feeling I had, the way of saying it, is he picked me up and has been taking care of me since. But until then, my mind wasn't ready. I couldn't see him. Do you understand? It's like, it's like the same thing. We know this kind of experience, You be certain, like you meet a certain person, you think, oh, yeah, this is an ordinary person. Then 2 years later, you fall in love with him. Suddenly the karma ripens. Something changes. Something triggered, something comes together. You hear a certain thing, and then one day it comes together. You understand my point. This is how karma ripens. It's like a seed. You can force it up to grow quicker, but you'll just bust it, You've got to wait for all the causes and conditions to come together. The timing is the thing. And with the view of karma, you get that sense of great patience, whereas we just want to manipulate everything and make it happen, But you can't force it. You've got to grow the seeds. So, create the causes. Allow the conditions to ripen. And when the time is right, it will flourish. So in other words, the answer to the question, you can have many gurus. For me, I would say I've got 2 root gurus, and in my mind, they're like the same person. It sounds curious to say that, but in my mind, they're the same mind, but different aspects. So Lama Zopa Rinpoche himself's got like 25, 30 gurus, But I think his root guru, not Lama Yeshe even, is another Lama. He says he's his root guru, but he has the same, you see he's like very impeccable as a disciple. He has perfect kind of appropriate devotion to every one of his Lamas, So you can have many Lamas. Mm-hmm.
Can they be from different lineages?
Yeah, of course. I mean, you've got karma with different... I've got Lamas from all the 4. I've got connections with different... His Holiness Sakya Trinzen, the head of the Sakyapas, is one of my Lamas, Dzongsa Khyentse Rinpoche, a Nyingma Lama. Sure, of course. So we finished death there, and we answered a few things about the guru business, isn't it? So, carrying on. So we were talking about this structure, remember, the Lam Rim, the preliminary contemplation of thinking about the nature of mind and its potential and beginninglessness and blah, 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 which we did at the very beginning, contemplating the necessity for a teacher, which we've just done briefly today. Given that you find a teacher, then you've got to, then they're the one who's going to help you develop that potential. And then we start thinking, doing the contemplation that a teacher recommends, which is like, again, priming our mind to really even begin to practice. And he's sort of, as I said, cobbled together this meditation on this business of meditating on your perfect human rebirth, thinking again and again about how fortunate you are. And so therefore, the reason of the thing of that, and you'd contemplate it more in depth on the different points that he mentions, and then your conclusion from this is you don't want to waste your life because it's so precious. So then the first contemplation, like grade 1 of junior school, is then to think about death and impermanence, as we've talked, with those 3 headings, And these, you see, you get this structure, and then what you do is you give it meat. You put meat on the bones from your own experience. Once you hear the point, you hear a few clues. You read one of the books from one of the lamas, and they give you a few ways to think, and then you start using your own experiences to give you, like, the example for me of the Puerto Rico one, the example of driving on a road and the goal moving ahead. You just get these examples that you use for your own mind to help you get it clear, because you're doing this thinking, you use your own examples. And then, of course, you apply it in daily life. Every time you hear someone dying, every time you see an ant dead or a rat dead or hear of a car accident or think about a war, it reminds you of death. It reminds you, you just don't rabbit on and go, oh, horrible old George Bush. You think of the people who died. You look at the photo. You look on the, especially a photo on a paper, because the television only lasts about 1 second of a picture. You look at a picture, and then you can do a little. You think of it right there. You think that person was living 5 minutes before. They didn't think they were going to die. There they were, their mummy taking care of their child. Suddenly they're dead. You look at the face of the son, the face of the child. I remember seeing one photo, one little boy in Afghanistan or somewhere, Iraq maybe, and it was in the back of a truck. And there was his great-grandfather, his grandfather, his grandmother, his mother, his 5 sisters, his uncle, his auntie, all there, dead. And you look at this little face, this little 10-year-old boy, and it's hard, you can't even to think of it is hard to bear. You think about it. You don't get angry. You don't go off into politics, and get angry with the people who did it to them. That's just politics. You think right there about their experience, right there. They were living 5 minutes before. They weren't thinking of being dead. And you look at it, and you think, and then you think, that will happen to me. That's how you use ordinary daily life. You don't have to look in deep Buddhist texts to find the grist for the mill for meditation on impermanence. It's in front of you every day. All this is doing, all our teachers giving us is ways of interpreting it. Buddha's teachings are giving us the way to think about it differently. But we always see it as out there, or we see it as politics. Like, I remember reading in Time magazine, like a 10 or 12 page report on Frank Sinatra's death and funeral and memorial services. So it was all just gossip, It wasn't about Frank. It was all about who Frank was. Of course, we can all have a lovely time talking about how he was and the best singer in the world and blah, blah, people all memorize, and his mafia this and his blah, blah, that. But meanwhile, there was this mind, just like you, living a life, doing negativity. You remember old Frank was a bit of bad man, bad-tempered old guy, angry at people. Maybe he didn't look at his mind like the rest of it. Maybe he didn't. We can speculate, perhaps. So can you only imagine, as he got older, finally on the deathbed, can you only imagine if all those negativity things that he did, just ordinary person, because his life was so exposed to everybody, you don't know who he is really, but just to say, Can you only imagine the terror? And even at the time of his death, apparently, his wife was there, screaming at him, hold on, like as if that's a good thing, like as if he wouldn't want to hold on, but he couldn't, because death is inevitable, So can you only imagine the terror? You've never thought of death. You think like this. Instead of all the gossip, you think, you hear Frank Sinatra died, and there's your meditation right there. You do it. It's a wake-up call. You can only imagine the terror for his mind. That's the way to think about death. Not, oh my God, death, I don't want it, I can't stand it, I'd rather die eating chocolate, I'd rather die when I didn't notice. You've got to go in there and think about it. Because when you confront something, that's what alleviates the fear. Fear is not being able to deal with it. When you know what's going on, when you've confronted it, that's what stops the fear. That's what's really interesting. You check that, it's true. Fear is because of ignorance. Fear is because we're unable to think about it. We don't want to think about it, or we don't have an answer to it. That's why we have fear. A friend of mine here, Lenny, who lives here in this neighbourhood somewhere, Boulder Creek, she said she was a nurse, and she was a hospice nurse for many of her years, and she said it was a given that most people died with fear. But she said the ones who didn't were the ones who had a spiritual practice. Now that's logical if you think about it. It's because people with a spiritual practice are the only people who are going to think about death. A communist, why would they think about death? Oh, I'm just going to turn into dust. How boring. If you're a materialist, you wouldn't want to think about death. It's only Christians who think about going to heaven, or Buddhists who think about reincarnation, who think about death and want to prepare for it. They're the ones, she said, who didn't have fear. So you think about that. It's very reasonable. There's nothing to fear. This is because it's unknown. So if you do have an answer, we've got to check if it's the right answer, but it seems to me even if it's the wrong answer, you won't die with fear. It's kind of interesting. Because you've thought about it, you've prepared for it. So every time you read about death in the papers, I love to read the obituary pages. to read the life of that person. Imagine, you see the photo of them was 30 years ago when they were young and gorgeous, you know. And you read it, you just imagine how it was for that person. They were young, just like you, thinking about life, getting ready for who they were going to become, meet their first husband, do this, meet their sixth husband, whatever, you know. You understand? Going through their life, all believing it's permanent, just like you, then suddenly they become old and wrinkled and they're dead. Their life gone like a dream. So then you've got to look at what the purpose of it is. Gone like a dream. Look up until now. If we're 40, 30, 60, 80, the past has gone like a dream. So did we make use of it? Did we sow good seeds? That's all we have got to look at. And we might as well keep growing good seeds from now, you know. That's how to make use of it. So it's constantly giving ourselves these little wake-up calls, using our daily experiences to remind us. That's how you, quotes, meditate on death. In a day-to-day sense, just daily life, you know. So then the next contemplation that a teacher would get us to do is taken from all the, because what a teacher's done is taken from all the Buddha's teachings and put them in this orderly way. He's just taken them all, you know, and put the essential point, a certain essential point of each of them in this orderly way. And it's psychologically kind of, you know, it's like psychologically structured. So you think about the preciousness of this life. Then you think about the impermanence of it, and this even increases your wish not to waste it. Now the next one will even increase our wish even more not to waste it. And so we think about the likely possibilities of the type of rebirth that are there as options for us. So this is where a teacher would get us then to contemplate the suffering of the lower realms. Because these are options. And the point here isn't to have compassion for them yet, that's not coming. It's to think about what it would be like to be born in the lower realms, which is what Buddha, of course, is saying is a possibility, depending on the karma that ripens. So there's the animal realm, the spirit realm, and the hell realms. These are just labels, as I've said, labels for certain levels of mental experience, and they're in the spectrum of suffering, you know. So the animal one, my feeling is the animal one is easy because it's right in front of us. You know, the hells and the spirits can be quite abstract for us. And especially if you read them in the Lamrim, they almost seem like cartoonish, you know. And it's hard for us to see it as a mental experience, as a real thing. But animals are right there. So what that demands is we've got to see them with a very new eye. Because right now we're completely imbued with the view, our mind is completely full of the view that an animal is a self-existent animal, made by God, doesn't have a soul, or a materialist one, it just simply is what it is, you know, coming together of a bunch of chemicals and elements and things. Very limited, doesn't have a brain, some don't have a brain, some feel things, some don't, you know, and they're just self-existently animals. But the Buddha's view is quite different, as we're seeing, you know. They're conscious, they're all mind possessors, just like humans. They're all mind possessors, sem-chens, mind possessors, living beings. They have a mind. But necessarily, the experience of being an animal is, what Buddha would say, the prevalent experience is unbearable suffering. And the prevalent one is the suffering of ignorance. You know, this concrete fundamentalist mind that sees things concretely. 1,000,000 times more intense than the most ignorant human mind. So you have to look at animals freshly with this perspective, and you can, you know, it's interesting to see it, interesting to think of it this way. The purpose here is to think about the suffering of being born like that, of having that life. Why? So that you can think, thank you very much, I don't want to be born like that. It's to give you a kind of a healthy revulsion of it, you know. So how do animals suffer? In what way do they suffer? Well, there's all sorts of ways. There's a very obvious way, isn't there? That they're, like, we can look at the domestic animals all around, how they're abused and used. They're like the servants of humans, aren't they? And especially these days, the sophisticated, you know, technology that's used to maximize the number of animals that get born so we can kill them, so we can get their flesh and get their parts. I mean, it's quite terrifying to look at it, you know. You look at the pig factories and you look at the chicken factories and everything. So just that level of suffering is enough to break your heart if you want to look into it carefully, think about it, meditate on it. And, you know, just look, but, you know, you've got to get used to the idea that they're suffering. We don't think that. Many of them, we don't think that. And even you can see, this is the strength of the karmic imprint to kill. That fisherman, for example, because the tendency to kill was so strong, it overrode any of his kindness and goodness. And so when he saw those fish flapping in his boats for all those 13 years that he was a fisherman, he never once saw suffering. So then you see even more dramatic pictures, you know. of like those seals. You know those seals and the way they kill them, just because of the tradition. You know, up in Canada or Alaska, isn't it? And the way they kill the seals, the baby seals, beat them to death, isn't it? So it's interesting. There's a nice human being there who goes home to his wife. He doesn't beat his wife. He's a kind guy. But he's got some tendency to kill, and he's got the karma to be born in Alaska, and so he runs like a magnet to that job, you know? I remember seeing really a huge, like right up in the freezing cold where they have these big boats and they go crab fishing, I think, some kind of those fish. And then again, the way just seeing the way they treat them. They're nice human beings, but they can't see that seal, they defend their method. They get upset if people try to stop them because it's tradition. It's how we've always done it. And if you just look at the naked experience of a seal, a baby seal, having its head bashed in and the blood coming and the little thing trying to get away, it's sort of obvious. Look at his body language. You can deduce there's some suffering there, you know, without being too intelligent. But the person can't see it. So don't just think, oh, poor seal. Look at the guy, poor guy, you know. You can't see it suffering because you've got the habit to kill. So that's the suffering of the person. But look at the suffering of the animal. So guess who got born as the baby seal? The previous seal killer, you know. I mean, who was that baby seal? But probably the seal killer from past life, you know, when he died. He got born as a baby seal, right there, had his head bashed in, just like he did. Roughly speaking, you know. So you look at and that's the gross suffering, okay? That's fairly evident. You look at the suffering of a little dog hurt, a little cat, a little mouse, although they don't like to think about mice and rats suffering, cockroaches. They show, even an ant, little tiny baby ant. Like I said, you get magnifying glass onto an ant when it's hurt. You're seeing the body language of suffering, you know. It's not just, I don't think it takes too much. I don't think it's not too much speculation to think that. So this is the Buddhist approach. We take it as a hypothesis, okay? Think of it from this perspective. See it from this perspective. That's the gross suffering. Now, like in the First Noble Truth, there are 3 levels of suffering. For humans, for example, the gross level, which is where you don't get what you want, you get hurt and mangled, which is what all we think of as suffering. But then you've got the subtle level of suffering, which is the mental suffering of the delusions, okay? Well, same for animals. And this is the real suffering of animals. The real suffering of animals is having that mind that's unbelievably blinkered and closed, ignorant, and therefore full of fear. Full of fear. That's the suffering of the animal. I remember Lama Zopa at some point saying something like, if we could just, for 5 minutes, we could experience directly the mind of your ordinary little doggy-woggy sitting there, wagging his little tail, looking like so cute. If we could experience that dog's mind for a few minutes, he said the suffering would be so intense, we could never bear even to waste another second of this human life. So suffering it would be. That level of ignorance, in other words. That's hard to think about. We don't think this way at all. And what you've got to remember is Buddhist psychology refers to all living beings, not just to humans. That's a very interesting point to take into consideration. Buddhist psychology of ignorance, attachment, anger, pride, jealousy, it refers to all living beings. And my feeling is you look at dogs, you look at cats, you look at mice, you look at those apes and things, you can see jealousy, you can see anger, you can see attachment. It's not difficult. We make it more complicated maybe. This Buddhist view is very straightforward. They've all got mind, and then due to karma they're born as that lion, born as that rat, born as that mouse. They're your human mummy of past life. They will be your human mummy of 20 lives ahead. It will be you of next life. I mean, this is what he's saying. Because mind, by the time it gets to the clear light mind, by the time it gets to very subtle consciousness at the time of death, there's not an atom left of any person. There's no Robina there. There's no male. There's no female. There's no human even. There's just consciousness with all the karmic imprints of everything Robina did. And as Lama Yeshe put it one time, right there at that very subtle consciousness is the potential for heaven or hell, the potential for rat life, human life, Buddhahood, depending on the karma that you've created. That very subtle consciousness is, and with its very subtle wind energy right there, is the building blocks of the new person, depending upon the karma that ripens. So it will go to a lion womb, and then the lion karma will ripen, and you'll turn into a lion person with claws that are ready made to kill. They're not made for affection. As His Holiness said, look at these hands. They're made for affection. It's the result of morality. These hands are the result of morality. Lions' hands are not the result of morality. They're the result of killing. And they're killing tools, aren't they? Look at those vultures with these eyes like lasers that can see a fish, and this unbelievable skill with these claws. That's a ready-made killing machine. What's that the result of? Killing. It's obvious. Killing created that shape. No one made that bird. The killing in the mind of that being created that shape. The killing in the mind of a being creates the lion. Look at the lion, the mummy lion. She doesn't have an option. You tell her every day, that buffalo that she's ripping the guts out for breakfast doesn't like it. Even if an intelligent human can see a fish flapping and can't see suffering, an intelligent human can see one of those pigs that they're slaughtering, or a chicken, or those seals, an intelligent, kind human can't see it, then can you only imagine the ignorance of a lion's mind? The karmic imprints in our mind blind us to seeing the truth. This is exactly what Buddha's saying. So, there's a human so overwhelmed by their own story about the fishing being good and nice and wonderful and, blah, 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 that even though he's intelligent, it's like he cannot see suffering. You look at your own life, your particular delusion, if you've got a habit of being angry, that person you're being angry with, you just can't see their suffering. You're so overwhelmed by your own self. That's how ego works. You're so caught up in your own delusion, your own attachment, your own needs, your own propensity. You can't see the suffering. So animals, this ignorance multiplied. That's the nature of their minds, so deluded, so limited, and then locked into their own sense of self. Lion nature, And then you look at just the ordinary way that wild animals live together. We say, oh, it's natural, it's nature. Isn't it wonderful? We go out there with our cameras, very objective, How fascinating, we say. I remember looking on the television, one program, and seeing, this long shot of the camera. It was like sunset in Africa, some African place with lots of animals, with giraffes and lions and all these beings, right? And it's a very long shot, and there's this very romantic music and a sunset. And all the animals are running. And there's all this kind of, whatever the commentary was. It looks so nice, But then you suddenly get yourself into the mind of the animal. Why are you running? You're not jogging, my dear. You're running because of fear, Animals don't run if they don't have to. They run for food or to get away from being food. You look at those fish shows about the ocean. All they're doing is killing each other, avoiding being killed, having sex, and getting food, which is part of the killing. That's it. I can't even conceive of the terror, the fear that must be in those minds all the time, Their minds, their consciousnesses. And then just following their instincts. The strong karmic habits. And no way of escaping from that mind. That is at least one thing about us humans. Even then, look how difficult. An intelligent person who's killing fish can't see the suffering. When you're angry, you can't see the hurt you're causing. When you lie, you can't see the suffering you're causing. You can't see it's wrong, because we have a tendency to defend whatever we do, I think of my gangster friends, the guys in prison who now, are practicing Buddhism. You hear about their lives and the harm they did, and the philosophy, the gang philosophy. It's as elaborate as any other philosophy. You have a book, fat book if they wrote it all down. The way of behaving, how you behave if you meet an enemy, the way you see it, the philosophy behind what they did. Unbelievable. And of course, since a tiny boy, you've been supporting this philosophy. So it's good to harm your enemy. It's good to rape that girl. It's good to stab that person. You call it good. And you have to defend yourself for it. You have to. You've got to have a philosophy that supports what you do. I remember when I was a bit of an old hippie, not hippie actually, when I was a lefty, living in London with my sister Janet, and we were both lefties, into all the rich people and how wicked they are, and and so then we began to shoplift. So, of course, it was an impulse that came, and it was an imprint, and we followed it. But we made it something very noble. Like, we were kind of stealing from all these rich capitalists. So you had to give it, and you had to label it this to kind of to defend yourself doing it. So the gangsters have to have a philosophy behind what you do. We make up our own philosophy and we call it good. There's a reason behind it. So the seal killers, not being mean about any of us. We all do this. The mind does this. You have to. It's cult. It's what my father. It's the way we do it. We've done it this way. You're so attached to the history of it and how it's done, and it's like these people who are trying to stop us from home killing the seals don't understand. So all of that philosophy blinds you from seeing the simple truth. That philosophy that we had blinded us from seeing the simple truth that we were doing something immoral, stealing things that didn't belong to us. We'd go down Oxford Street, go to all the fancy stores, steal a few £100 worth of things. We're quite modest in our stealing. And then send them home to Christmas for the family, And then at some point, I remember when then my sister went back home and I was somewhere else. I remember I continued to steal. I lived in Alice Springs for a while. I started doing karate. And I just used to steal. I'd go to the supermarket. I was really good at it, I was so arrogant about it because I was so clever. I'd walk in and then I'd get a box full. I'd put everything in the box and I'd walk out, not trying to sneak anything. I'd walk out like it was just mine, No one ever stopped me. I'd steal bottles of alcohol, packets of cigarettes. And then at some point I thought, this is absurd. So I stopped, luckily. But I had to defend it. Then I realised, aren't I lucky, that I realised it was foolish, it was stupid, so I was able to stop, But we build up a story that defends this thing that we do, And of course when the habit is strong, you can't even see it as bad. Even if someone tells you, they laugh at you, You laugh at them. This is how karma works. So poor animals, completely, the negative karma ripened at the time of death, never looked at death, never looked at impermanence, never thought about it. All the habits of doing these negative things, killing, lying, stealing, ordinary daily jobs, nothing, not being Hitler. I'm not talking about being mean Hitler or a terrorist or anything. Not looking at our motivation, not looking at the tendency, not looking at the harm we're doing, defending it. Then you die. Well, of course, negativity is going to ripen like crazy. Off you go to the lion birth. Then you're lost for quite a few lives then. So the point here is looking at the suffering of being an animal because you're deciding you don't want to be born like that. Thank you very much. It's sort of like going to a movie that shows you all about the suffering of cigarette smoking. You're so attached to the cigarettes. So you go and you look at all the horrible lungs and all the people with holes in their throats and all this, and then you get a wake-up call. You go, oh my God, I don't want that. That's the point here. Not compassion yet. It's to try to think about how it would be suffering to be, an animal. We don't think like that. We think, oh, how wonderful to fly, all these things. But it's interesting because it's seen in a very different way. And of course, it's a contextual thing here. If you want to have a very long neck, well, best to be born a giraffe, isn't it? It's fine, it's true. If you want to fly, it is best to be a bird. A lot cheaper than trying to build an aeroplane. But if you want to be, if you want to have some intelligence that hopefully gives you the opportunity to change yourself, then probably best to be a human. This is the simple context. It's not some absolute that we're talking. It's not like some hierarchical thing that animals are bad. It's just that from the point of view of wanting to develop your mind and from the point of view of having a reasonably spacious mind that isn't too fearful, bad enough being a human, look at our level of fear, but better than being an animal's. If you think about it, try and just analyse just what you see even, Try and see it in a different way. So then, of course, you think, well, whom can I turn to? Whom can I turn to give me the methods to stop this cancer, Whom can I turn to give me the methods to prevent myself when I do die, which is inevitable, and who knows when, it could be today. Whom can I turn to give me the method? So this leads us to the next contemplation, which in this case is, it's like the first one of the four opponent powers. It's refuge. Sorry, the second one. You think about the qualities of the Buddha, because we're turning to the Buddha here. But you can decide, this is a Buddhist context here. It could be anything, you can work out whom you turn to. So here you think of now the qualities of a Buddha. So we're going to talk about that tonight. We're going to talk about refuge tonight. Because, as I mentioned, Khenzo Rinpoche is going to be giving refuge tomorrow. And so people will be coming tonight. So we'll talk about refuge tonight. So you think about the qualities of the Buddha, the Dharma, the Sangha, the various things you're going to rely upon. And then you have, because it's like doing the checking for the teacher. You now check up on the doctors. You check up, and then you decide that's a valid doctor. And then now you begin to put your money where your mouth is, which is the next contemplation, which is karma. And that's the culmination of this first scope, impermanence to karma. So if you look at impermanence, the lower realms and refuge, they're really like sort of like priming your mind to give you the logical basis for wanting to abide by the laws of karma. So this first stage of practice is no great dramatic level of thinking about karma. It's simply at the level of not wanting to get a miserable old life when you die. That's all. So you learn to know what to avoid doing so that you don't get that kind of rebirth. And that's why you have your little checklist of the 10 non-virtues. It's a very practical, step-by-step approach, you know. When you go to the next scope, which we'll talk about tomorrow, we've done it already, actually. We've done a lot of it, talking about the suffering in the mind, the delusions. We've done that already. We'll go into that. But that's where it comes, the next scope, high school. This first level, abiding by the laws of karma, you merely refrain from killing, lying, stealing, bad-mouthing, gossiping, this, that, sexual misconduct. Why? Because if they ripen, you know, we read the list yesterday, you don't want to have those kinds of experiences. So at least to protect yourself, you stop the smoking so you don't get the cancer. That's all. It's practical. It's not moralistic. It's not judgmental. It's not someone going to punish you. It's just learning to see in a very different way, I agree, the nature of your actions and how they bring your own experiences. In other words, recognizing this fact that there are consequences to oneself of one's own actions. That's it. That's the one. So any questions about that before we have dinner? So sweet, yeah.
Based on the principles of reincarnation, somebody brought up the fish last night, I think, and you were just talking about the fish again, and it makes me think that the fish on my plate could be my mother from my past life. Can you talk about that?
That comes later.
Okay.
You can talk about that, sure we can. That comes later. We'll make that as the first one of the first steps in, yeah, it's in the stages of developing compassion. We'll go into a little way of talking about that, yeah. Yeah, you might.
This is just a little housekeeping thing.
Sure, darling. Oh, okay, go on.
I promised that I would ask what your instructions were for the morning in terms of silence, because there seemed to be some confusion about how long you wanted it.
Oh, just up
In
until
the morning?
breakfast time.
Up until breakfast time?
Yes.
Okay.
But for the last 2.5 days, it'll be total silence.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay.
And so unless people particularly want to have breakfast silent, because it's up to what people want. You see, okay, I never said this to you, and I should have. But I find talking really useful when you talk about this stuff. But if you're going to just talk about the weather and gossip, then you might as well be quiet. So I should have said that. But it's really good, because then you make the whole experience part of the course. You can talk about the weather anytime when you leave, you know. So the thing is, I meant to say, so I think it's good to talk, but try to make it on the topic. So if you're going to talk at breakfast, talk about this stuff. And it doesn't have to be serious. You can crack jokes and laugh, you know. But keep it on track. Don't just keep it gossip. But if you don't want to talk about it, you be silent. And then on the last 2.5 days, it'll be total silence anyway. But if you'd like breakfast to be silent and maybe talk after the first session, I don't know, what do you guys want? Do you talk at breakfast? What do people want? What else do people want? Is there a feeling you'd like to have silence at breakfast? No? Yes? No, don't worry, darling. It's just people say what they want. Anybody have a particular feeling about that? Well, no, so then you just have to just decide you're going to be silent and you keep your own silence, if that's what you want, you know. And because in the last 2.5 days, we've only got 2 more days anyway, you think about it, it's going very quickly. Tuesday and Wednesday. Thursday, Friday and Saturday will be silent. Yeah? Okay? All right. So then we can stop now if you like. Yes, darling, go. Give her the mic.
Since we have a little time, I was just thinking in terms of if we look at our planet and evolution, and before there were actual humans in the planet. So does that mean that at some point, the morality, ripened? The karma? How does that fit?
I understand. First of all, remember the Buddha's saying, this is not the first universe. It's just, Big Bang, no problem. Not the first Big Bang. So universes are beginningless, minds are beginningless, therefore mental experiences and realms are beginningless, right? So this planet that we think of, called Earth, and this galaxy that it exists in is the karmic appearance of this human world of ours. Okay, so we can track back when it began and all this. It's true. All sorts of things are going on now. We can track the certain time when humans began and all this. Buddhism maybe would argue with the idea, the Darwin idea, about how we came from monkeys and apes. There's a different way probably of interpreting that. That then we could say, before humans on this planet, we were humans. There was human minds in other places. There are other realms that are called human realms. This is how Buddha would say. They're not places you can fly to on an aeroplane. They're like realms of it, like they call, what is it in science fiction? Dimensions, different dimensions. That's right. So it's not the only human experience. And so what's interesting is this, though. This is a very different take on things. Buddhism would say, eons ago, Buddhism would say that right now we're in a degenerate time, that things are going downhill fast, meaning there's more delusion and more sophisticated violence than ever before. And let's face it, we're very sophisticated in our violence now, because our minds are so brilliant, you know. And that delusions are kind of rampant, therefore more suffering, more pollution, more, I mean, this is how they'd say, we're in a degenerate time. But they're thinking in terms of eons. They're this vast picture of eons of time, eons of time. Quite different from even the way we think about the time of this planet, you know, this galaxy. So eons ago, as they would say, a human birth was much more pure than the human birth that we have now on this planet. So the assumption has to be that it wasn't on this planet, if we think of it that way. We had like subtle light bodies, and the life lasted a long time. We had super intelligence and could easily become enlightened because the mind was so clear, so wise. There was no gross delusions at all, and therefore no gross physicality. There was subtle physicality, subtle wind energy, subtle light bodies, right? So gradually, the delusions were there. So over eons, as the universe becomes more degenerate as a whole, right, they say, the minds gradually, the attachment began to ripen. So as attachment began to ripen and the delusions, that kind of makes the subtler physical energies heavier. Because the heavier the physical energy, the heavier the delusions. Look at a lion's energy, physical energy, so heavy, you know. Its energies are physical energy is so gross to fit its mind. So as delusions began to ripen, literally our wind energy became more gross, and we literally, like personal evolution, created senses, holes that need things to be put into them. There was none of that before. We're just pure subtle mind with subtle light bodies that could ingest teachings and get enlightened. But now we're really gross. So the way I say it, we become so gross that finally humans began being born on this planet looking like a bunch of apes. We're so common. Look at us. They say there's only, you know, we're so similar to apes. And so the external view of it is the Darwin one, that we came from apes. Okay? Well, the Buddhist one would be, you see, the one of evolution sees it as external. Karma really is like internal evolution. Because today you're a human, but if you don't put your life together, next life you're going to be a lion. So forget evolution for you. There's the species, yes, we can see species. And so the species, different minds though go into those bodies. Different minds. So if you've created lion karma, you're going to go into the lion species. The next life you'll be in the rat species. So there are species, which is the external condition, basically, for minds to go to. So human life began at some point on this earth. We can see that. And it maybe wasn't even the ones that look like humans, you know. Then they say at some point, what do they call the missing link? Do they still talk about the missing link? Anyway, whatever, that old-fashioned way of looking at it. Because we keep seeing the external and we keep trying to find when humans began from that point of view. Whereas the Buddhist one is seeing it more from the point of view of karma. And when the time got to be right, when the grossness became so strong, we then started being born on this planet. But the we as humans mightn't be the same group. But the human species, if you like, was another whole place. I don't know, it sounds a bit complex. But so at some point, the humans did indeed begin. But look how gross we are. And basically the gross bodies are like, in other words, the humans now, of course now is all we know. We can't imagine, there's no concept in ordinary history of previous lives of other humans, you know, we just think of these humans. But we're really very gross in the sense we've got these gross senses, and all the actions we do, like to feed these senses, are actually animal actions. They've come from our animal rebirths. So some people, you can see, don't have much interest in food, have not much interest in sex maybe, almost rather ethereal. You can say they haven't got much of the heavy negative karma, they haven't got much heavy delusions. Some of us have very heavy sexual attachment. It's animal karma, from propensities from being an animal. Look at BTK, Mr. Poor old BTK. Or I think of Jeffrey Dahmer years ago, this guy called Jeffrey Dahmer, you know? Remember, people must know about him. He tortured people and then took their skulls and pulled their bodies apart and put them in the fridge and ate their flesh and all these things that we think are so repulsive that we just freak out when we hear about it. Well, check animals, please. Look at what animals do. You know, some animals have to kill before they eat. They won't even bother eating otherwise. The killing is part of it. So they're torturers. They've got these incredibly powerful imprints. And look at the imprints of sexual attachment in animals, you know. Some creatures, I saw one of those shows again on the animal show, there's one creature like a big sluggy thing, you know, under the earth. She basically is a sex machine. She just pumps out babies, thousands a day. She must have billions of babies in her little lifetime. And all the little worker slugs going around, they're just feeding her these sperms. She just pumps out babies. Now, I mean, that's interesting. That seems to me the result of sexual attachment, you know. So, what do termites do? Lots of sex. Oh, that's a termite. Oh, really? Is that what they do? The fat queen has all the babies. There you go, there you go. Must be there you go. That's it. So, you look at all the, you know, so the things that are human qualities are the virtuous ones. Kindness, goodness, compassion, intelligence. We've still got some of those, but look at us. Look at the human world. And it's very interesting the way you get born in this. There's one book I remember reading, it's called The Tibetan Art of Parenting. It's a baby book, basically, how Tibetans relate to having babies and how you get ready to have babies, and if you can't conceive, what practices you to get a baby, all these things. And so, of course, because they think about it as karma, you know, if you might go to your Tibetan doctor, but also you go and do your Tara practices and you do some purification practices to create the cause, to connect with that consciousness that needs a birth, needs a womb. And they'd say very much, definitely when you have sex, you don't have it with a lot of lust or a lot of greed or a lot of violence or really like drunk or something, because that's just very heavy deluded. So you attract very heavy deluded consciousnesses to come to you. Now, excuse me, without being rude about us poor humans, look at the earth. More and more, the suffering of ordinary children. I mean, these kids are like 5 and 6 and they're in these prisons now. They're drug dealing and killing people and raping. I mean, some of these gangsters, I know, they've been raping since they're 11. So it's like more and more we are deluded and uncontrolled and just have our sex anytime, anywhere, violent, lusting, raping, completely like animals, excuse me. You're going to attract really unhappy consciousnesses. So we're kind of bringing the human realm down really fast, isn't it? Anyway, that's not way off the topic, but there you go. So the animal qualities, we can see strong craving for food. I mean, I can see in my life really attached to meat, you know. Meat for me is food. Now that's animal karma. Very simple. Look at, you know, you taste like the animal gets the blood and you just want to get more. You smell the meat, it's so delicious, you know. That's animal karma. Very strong sensory experiences. Sex for sure is that one. And look how deluded we are with our sex these days. Not necessarily these days, but in general, so much kind of uncontrolled, violent, dissatisfied sex. You know, old-fashioned sex, how boring. And do it upside down and with 3 and 2 and do it violently and harm each other. I remember reading a detailed story, an interview with in New Yorker. You can tell I read magazines, can't you? How do you think I get all my examples? No point in reading Tibetan books and you talk about yaks, you know. You know, a very detailed interview with this woman in New York who was who, I don't know what she called herself, there are very divisions of it too, but she harmed people, you know, sexual, what do you call, sadistic type thing. Highly sophisticated ways that she would harm people. And then, of course, highly sophisticated ways that they wanted to be harmed to get their pleasure. It's sort of like we're going to go to any lengths to get satisfaction, but there's no, as Elvis sings, I can't get no satisfaction. Because Buddha says that's the point. You'll never get satisfaction by getting cake, getting bodies, doing this, doing that. So we can make it really sophisticated and we can do the most incredible things. What about that guy, you know, who advertised on the internet for somebody who wanted to be killed? by him, a German guy. And he found a person. A person came and agreed to do whatever and then to be killed by him. So then they're saying it's not murder because the guy wanted it, because that's how he got pleasure. So we go to any lengths, to go to any lengths, using our senses to get some satisfaction. Well, that's animal karma, Buddha says. And we're just increasing, we're dragging the human realm down. We might as well, it's like so animal-like. Not being mean about animals. We've all been animals countless times. That's how come we can do these things, because we've been animals. So we're just going to go rushing back. And what about all the furries? All these people who have a strong sexual attachment to having sex with their furry toys. They identify with being animals. They don't like humans. They prefer to be animals. They have their conferences together, dressing up in their Mickey Mouse and their Peter Fox clothing, They say it's like cartoonish, and you can even speculate it's from the habit of being totally caught up in animals and cartoons and things. It leaves karmic imprint. Everything you see, hear, touch, taste, smell leaves an imprint in your mind, a habit to do it. They prefer animals. They prefer, stuffed toys, in fact. And one said, he didn't like smooth skin, he prefers fur. This is their whole thing. And there's many levels of them too, this whole subculture again, all created, based on certain habits that people have. People have, do, what do you call surgery. I've read about one guy and it's interesting, furries talk about themselves as being vaguely gay. They're mainly white males, and they're usually techies. This seems to be the experience among themselves. Truly, it's very interesting. They're super intelligent. So one of them, he's genius at what he does in computers and things, but he's really identifies with being a tiger. So he's had surgery, whiskers, stripes, ears, a tail. Well, Buddha says, don't worry, just create the cause, you'll be one next life. Don't have to hurry, you don't have to spend all that money, There was one lady in South Africa who likes panthers. But she's got all this plastic surgery to almost have like panther-like face, So, it's interesting. So anyway, to think about the suffering of animals, the narrow mind, the closed mind, the fear, the ignorance, the destruction, the attachment, the aggression, and it's programmed, no choice. Somehow, try to think how that's suffering. This is the one. So, okay, let's go and eat our non-meat dinner. But then don't get all holy about that. Think of all the thousands of creatures. Even though we try to do it nicely, still millions of creatures have died, even for our vegetables. All the creatures who around the leaves when they were picked, and the ones who were squashed on the road when they drove them to the vegetable shop. All the ones who were killed by the spray, if it's not organic, Can't help. Buddhism says there's not an atom of space you won't find sentient beings. And so we're constantly harming them. And so as Lama Yeshe says, just doing that, you harm sentient beings. Just by existing, you harm sentient beings. So the point is, we can't avoid it. That's the suffering of this universe. But we can have the intention not to harm, to do whatever we can not to harm sentient beings. That's the best we can do. And then to remember their suffering. And then vow not to do it. That's the main thing. Okay, so think of your dinner. Oceans of nectar, blessed with Om Ahung, Om Ahung, Om Ahung. And you imagine offering it to all the gurus, Buddhas, Bodhisattvas, all the suffering sentient beings, gods, humans, animals, predators, hell beings, bhaga beings. Pervading space, and they all experience the joy, the pleasure of this food you happily offer. Lama Sangye Lama Che, Dejan Lama Gerun Te, Kungi Jebo Lama Te, Lama Namla, Chirpa Bu.